Okay, brilliant. Hi, everyone. Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to SME for Labour and Ibrahim for putting on this event. For those that you don't know me, my name is Mabel. I am a councillor in the London Borough of Bexley. I've been a councillor for 7 years and a Labour Party member for 12 years. I was delighted to be asked to chair this event today because I have a bit of a soft spot for American politics myself. I had the pleasure of joining, hi Stephen, nice to see you. I had the pleasure of, joining the Democrats in the Ohio in 2016 for their American elections, and I was so disappointed with the results. But I'm really pleased that we were able to turn the tide at this election, and really excited to hear from our great speakers today about how we can replicate those winning results over here. So, firstly, to introduce our two speakers, we've got Matt Browne, who is a senior fellow at Centers for American Progress in Washington, DC, and a founder of Global Progress. He's also a member of the governing board and former director of the Policy Network, where he worked closely with leaders and prime ministers and presidents across the globe and organizations such as the UN. And Matt has also run the international press operations for Labour's elections in 2001 and 2005. So it'd be great to hear from you. We also have I believe we have Stephen Kinnick MP, who has a long history in the Labour Party. I think he became a party member at the age of 15, and he was first elected as the Member of Parliament for Aberavon in 2015. And he holds the post of Shadow Minister for Asia and the Pacific. So he's got a lot of experience in the UK and international politics. He's very pro-business and spoken passionately about the need to protect business during Brexit negotiations. So I look forward to hearing from both of them about how we're going to win our next general election. So just before I pass over to the panelists, who are going to give us brief presentations, and then we'll open it up to Q&As, I just wanted to say, if you have a question, if you haven't submitted it via email, please do just drop it in the chat box. We only have an hour today, so I will ask the majority of the questions, but if you do want to ask your question as well, please do signal in the chat. I ask that you keep it as brief as possible because, as I mentioned, we've only got an hour. And this session is being recorded. And at the end of the session, we will take a picture. It's not compulsory that you take part in the picture. You can turn off your camera. But if you do, the more of us, the merrier. Please do put on your best Zoom smiles for us all. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass to Matt. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. And I'll pass over.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Mabel. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks to everyone at SME for Labour for the invitation. And I'm glad to be speaking alongside my old friend, Stephen Kinnock. So what I thought I would do is run through three things very quickly. I won't do a presentation, but maybe try and get through this in 10 minutes or so. So we've got more time for a back and forth and questions. But I thought I'd talk a little bit about the election, what can be learned from that. From the challenges and the agenda that are going to shape the Biden administration, and then a little bit about some future areas for potential collaboration between the US Democrats and the Labour Party. And then I thought I'd leave the tricky question of what Labour needs to learn precisely from this to win the next election to Steve. He's probably much better placed to answer that question than I am. So look, when it comes to the election in 2020, and thanks, Mabel, for all you did in Ohio in 2016. Maybe the missing factor this time, in 2016 was, well, we can get into that, but it was a very disappointing factor for all of us. But we're really grateful for the work that you all did from Labour, those of you who came across on the ground. I'd like to look at sort of three things around the election. I'd say the coalition, the narrative, and the agenda that or the strategy that drove Biden. I think the first thing to consider from a sort of progressive party perspective, whether that's the Democrats or UK Labour or others that might be interested in this, is that in some ways Biden was the only person that could hold all parts of the Democratic coalition together. He was not the presumptive nominee by any stretch of the imagination, even though he came in as the vice president to former President Obama. In fact, he is one of the few presidents and few presidential candidates who actually arrived at that post without winning the Iowa caucus or the New Hampshire primary process. But what did become clear was that Biden was the one person that could hold everything from the sort of Buttigieg moderates through to the Bernie progressive wing of the party. He was the sole unifying factor. And I think that he could do that for a couple of reasons. I think the first thing is that he was seen as a safe and a competent pair of hands with experience. But that related to that, he was also quite prepared to put forward a radical agenda. I mean, you mentioned the 2016 election. When you think about Hillary's policy agenda, there was no way in which she ran on a very aggressive Green New Deal, climate-focused agenda. Yet Biden had the courage to put climate, race, and economic inequality right at the heart of his agenda. So although he was seen by many as a kind of moderate force within the party, part of the party's elite and establishment, that also allowed him to bring along and to push forward a much more progressive agenda than many other presidential candidates had. So I think that that was really the key to his success in the election. It was, and that allowed him to hold together a coalition that included people from the suburbs, African women in the large American cities, but also to bring in from Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania a larger share of the unionized vote than Trump had received in 2016. So there was a project called Unions 2020, and it was in part Biden's sort of aggressive economic agenda and his ability to reach out to blue-collar workers that allowed him to win Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So that was a unique coalition, I think, that only Biden could hold together. I spoke about his agenda, and I do think his agenda is key. I don't believe that elections are won and lost around agenda, but I do think they're won, certainly like a detailed policy agenda, but I do think you have to send out a very clear vision for what you want to achieve for the country. And I think you have to set out an idea of what your priorities as president would be. And Biden had four very clear priorities, which underscored the kind of coalition that he was trying to pull together in the US. And those priorities were primarily domestic priorities, although they have international agenda tinges to them. The first was obviously to tackle COVID. The second was to reboot the economy. The third was climate. And the fourth was tackling racial justice. These shouldn't be seen as separate pillars, really. They're sort of a set of concentric circles that overlap in a variety of ways and complement one another. But on COVID, he was very clear, and in some ways it was easy for him to run against President Trump, who'd really sort of denied most of the science surrounding the COVID pandemic. And that had really led to both not huge numbers of people being hospitalized or losing their lives, but also a massive economic contraction in the United States. It's fair to say that had Trump tackled COVID probably a little bit more aggressively, he may well have been elected president. But you can spend a lot of time in parlor games questioning that or not. But tackling COVID, both in terms of using the science and organizing a strong agenda where the state was at the heart of a public health program, was key to Biden's policy agenda. He promised to vaccinate 1 million people a day for the first 100 days, to open the schools within 100 days, to mandate mask wearing in interstate travel, but also in federal public buildings and elsewhere. So he had a very strong idea about, one, how to get more vaccines in the arms of Americans, but also how to mitigate the worst elements of the pandemic, and that was crucial to his agenda. I think the second thing to look at was around the economy. He pushed a very clear narrative, which I think there's something that Labour can learn from, which is this notion of middle out economics. It was a notion that was pushed forward by people like Heather Boushey and Jared Bernstein, who are now in his Council of Economic Advisors. And it was a general view that the economy grows from the middle out. That is, the economy grows by supporting the middle class, strengthening the middle class, focusing on jobs, and ensuring that you bring more people into the middle class. And so that's really underpinned a lot of what he's trying to do, first of all, around the recovery, but also as he thinks about how he wishes to tackle climate going forward. He's going to put a lot of emphasis around supporting getting women back into work. He sees them as a core constituency. That means both in terms of of more flexible working conditions, but also in terms of child support and daycare, universal daycare. He will push heavily on infrastructure, particularly around transport, both in terms of investing in public transport infrastructure, but also in terms of electric vehicles. I think one of the things that the Biden administration feels, and those close, if you look at people like Brian Deese, who is the chief economic advisor, he has been with BlackRock for the last 4 years since leaving the Obama administration, focusing on shifting into long-term investment into the energy economy. So they will want to make sure that when it comes to electric vehicles, when it comes to renewable energy sources and clean energy sources, that the United States is at the forefront of that. And so this agenda, climate being the third part of his agenda, this agenda is an agenda for jobs and investment, and one in which he sees the ability to build coalitions between rural America, blue-collar workers and unionized workers, and the investment community, that this no longer has to be a sort of division between urban value voters and those in the industrial sectors, but that actually industry can be driven by a Green New Deal. He has, of course, also sort of put forward, he's rejoined Paris, he will host a summit on climate on Earth Day on April the 22nd and re-engage in those ways. He will also look to do a border adjustment tariff. But I really think the lesson for Labour from Biden's agenda is, how do you take the Green New Deal and make it a jobs agenda and an agenda for the revitalization of industry and the industrial sector and manufacturing in our countries. And then the final thing that's been core to Biden's agenda is the issue of racial justice. And obviously, like in the midst of the pandemic and the economic crisis, there was a senseless murder of George Floyd, and the arrival as a sort of global phenomenon of the Black Lives Matter movement. It is very clear to Biden that he sees the Black community, but also Black women in particular, as a cornerstone of his coalition, and as a constituency that needs greater support from US government than it has hitherto ever received. Now that means that both on, like in all of those three previous areas, whether it's in public health, whether it's in economic recovery and investment, or whether it's in climate, he will introduce a racial justice dimension in a way that hitherto has not been seen. He's also been very, very forthcoming in appointing Black women to positions of power. Obviously, Kamala Harris is the first Black and Asian vice president, female vice president of the United States. But if you look across the board, his ambassador, his head of to the United Nations, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, these are all women of color holding very prominent roles. And I think this is something that he will seek to advance and advocate going forward. So sort of what are the lessons then for Labour? I mean, I sort of alluded to these earlier, and we should draw them out more in conversation. But one of the lessons is that if you can hold the party together and have an aura of competence about you, then you can actually put forward a more radical vision and a more radical policy agenda than you might otherwise be able to do. So as I said, Biden was seen as a very safe pair of hands, somebody that all walks of American life could put confidence in. But the agenda that he put forward and his vision for America, particularly in terms of the Green New Deal and tackling racial inequity, was very bold, and bolder certainly than Hillary Clinton's, but one would say also than Barack Obama's in 2008 and 2012. And then I think the other key element to learn is to show that you have people of competence that can deliver this agenda. Like Biden has brought in seasoned professionals, whether it's John Kerry on climate, or wherever else you look across the board, who can really drive forward and make sure that government is working and aggressively getting business done. And he's set out in terms of how he wants to deal with this in terms of his dealings with Congress, to also be very aggressive, to show that he's willing to push forward his agenda using executive orders and other means. So, what does this mean as well? A few quick points, or maybe a minute or two, with regards to the Democrats and Labour or UK-US relations. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the UK will remain a core ally of the United States, particularly when it comes to issues of national security. but we have to be 100% clear about this. The UK is a less important ally now than it has been for decades because of Brexit. Brexit has marginalized Britain in the eyes of America. America no longer sees London as the place it can stop off on the way to getting its business done in Europe. And the Biden administration of many of its advisors will look to advance and empower the EU and see it as a more equal partner. So we'll no longer be a bridge. And I think that means that we will need to think a little bit more innovatively, Labour as well, not about what that means for our role in the world. Can Britain become a connector, an innovator, a defender of fundamental rights, more so than just a bridge that helps bring two important continents together? But I think we should also be pretty clear that while some people were excited about the idea that Boris Johnson and Joe Biden may have difficult and troubled relationships, I think that you'll see certainly over the next year that relationship is strong and sound. The fact that we have the presidency of the G7 and that we're hosting COP26 means that there will be not just on the surface, but also below some very deep collaboration. And so I think Labour has to be very canny about where it looks for opportunities here. I think those opportunities lie in sort of 2 or 3 fundamental areas, and I'll mention a couple. The first is around the Good Friday Agreement. This is very important to Joe Biden, and he would see any agreement and breaking of the Northern Ireland Protocol that put the Good Friday Agreement in question would be something that he would be exceptionally worried about. So I think Labour needs to offer unconditional support towards that agreement and how it relates to its UK's relationships with the European Union. I think the second area, which is unexplored, is really how we deal with great powers like China and Russia and the role of the City of London. I think that there will be a desire on the part of the Biden administration to be much more aggressive about how we deal with Russia, including and kleptocracies in general. And I think there will be a strong urge to push on illicit financing and taking control of the means in which the oligarchs close to Putin and others move their money around. So I think that offers an untapped policy area where Labour can be helpful to the US president and to a broader progressive agenda in general. But I'll leave those comments there, which I hope sets the scene for Steve to set out some brilliant ideas about how we really learn the sort of broader policy and strategic lessons to make sure that that Labour wins the next election. But thanks for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Matt. That's really, really great. I'm going to let Stephen speak next, but I just wanted to take this opportunity and say hi to Tracy Browne MP and Lord McNichol, who joined us today. So thank you so much for joining. Stephen, would you like to give us your presentation, please?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mabel, and thanks so much to SME for Labour for putting this event together. It's such an important moment for us to be having this conversation, and very difficult to follow, Matt. I don't actually know anybody in the UK who knows more about American politics than Matt. He's more or less a Yank. I like to call him that when we have the opportunity. But it's really great to hear from him because of the way in which I think he has such a profound understanding of what's happening in terms of American politics and why Biden managed to achieve such a great victory. I mean, I don't think we can ever sort of go too far in terms of drawing parallels between the UK and the US. Sometimes I think that we go a bit far in that it's tempting to do. But there are some very clear parallels in terms of where Joe Biden is and where Keir Starmer is. And I think that's very much about both leaders are going to have to find a way of charting a course for our country, for their respective countries, after seismic political shocks. And obviously the seismic political shock in the United States was Trump, and here it's been Brexit. And I think Keir has got a lot to learn from Joe in terms of understanding the underlying causes of those shocks and appreciating them and acknowledging them, not just rejecting them and accusing everybody that may have either backed Brexit or backed Trump of being a racist. You know, that's lesson number one. Do not ever refer to those whose views you may not agree with as a basket of deplorables. And that, I think, is something that Joe has done so brilliantly, because I think he's shown with empathy and understanding that he absolutely appreciates why people felt left behind, why they felt ignored by political elites, why they felt that their parts of the country had been completely abandoned by the decision-making processes in the centre. And that's, I think, lesson number one for Cllr, is to absolutely demonstrate that that understanding is there. And, you know, the lesson from the 2019 general election is that Labour was seen to have abandoned and stopped listening to those communities that where we so badly lost, of course, on that fateful night in December 2019. So I think there's something there which I guess is around building a whole nation politics. And obviously I don't generally use webinars as opportunities to promote my book, but I'm obviously going to take the opportunity right now to do that. In 2018, I wrote a book called Spirit of Britain, Purpose of Labour, Building a Whole Nation Politics to Reunite Our Divided Country. And the premise of it was that the country had divided into these two tribes that I called the cosmopolitans and the communitarians, and that Labour had essentially become a cosmopolitan party, getting great support in the cities, urban graduates and people with a particular worldview. And since really the 2000s, this sort of long decoupling between Labour and our communitarian heartlands. And that was really began to have a serious impact for us in the ballot box in 2015, also in 2017, where of course we won in places like Kensington but lost in Mansfield. So the writing was on the wall for 2019. And my argument has always been really that if we're going to win general elections, we have to reunite the cosmopolitans and the communitarians as our electoral coalition. And it's only once we begin to reunite that coalition that we can actually start to do many of the radical things that in government that Matt talked about. So how do we reconnect with our communitarian heartlands? And I think that there's, a lot of what Matt has already set out is what Joe Biden has successfully managed to do. He's reconnected the Democrats with their communitarian heartlands. But I think that there's many more steps that we need to take before we can do that. And I think, broadly speaking, it's about place patriotism and prosperity. We've got to show that we are a party that truly understands the importance of place in politics and people's sense of identity, the sense that you've got to reconnect politics with people's opportunities in the places that they live. Social mobility is great, but social mobility shouldn't become synonymous with geographical mobility. So you have to leave the town that you were born and brought up in order to better yourself, to get a better job or whatever it might be. I think it's about family. It's about really showing that family is at the heart of what motivates people, and particularly, I think, place and family for communitarians. It's about community and showing that we understand that, you see your high street just ripped to pieces by globalization, by what the internet giants have done to our local high streets and what that means for the social fabric of communities. And then I think it's very much around country and the national security agenda. I think the British people want to see us standing up for democracy and human rights and the rule of law, and standing up to authoritarian regimes, but also really showing that national security agenda, because we're patriotic internationalists. I have to say I'm foursquare behind Cllr appearing in public with the Union Jack behind him. I know that certain colleagues in our party seem to object to the idea of the leader of the opposition appearing with a Union Jack. I simply cannot understand where they're coming from, because if you are auditioning to become the Prime Minister of this country, you need to demonstrate that you're very comfortable and that you love the country that you want to lead. I would of course like to see him appearing with the Welsh Dragon and the Scottish Saltire and the George Cross behind him as well, and that's maybe the next step. But this whole idea of patriotic internationalism, demonstrating that we understand that the kind of isolationism that led to Brexit is actually not patriotic. There's nothing patriotic about making your country poorer, about making your communities poorer, about exposing your business community to vast amounts of extra red tape, and, by the way, diminishing your influence. As Matt so eloquently put it, you know, we're going to become less important to Washington, DC, because of the fact that we're no longer a member of the European Union. There's nothing patriotic about that. So I think we've got to show that we believe in sovereignty, in the primacy of the nation state, but the nation state strengthens its ability to act when it pools its sovereignty and cooperates with other nation states, and particularly with our democratic allies. I think we need, the second piece around prosperity is we've got to demonstrate that we are a pro-business party, and what Matt talked about, the way in which Biden was able to push forward a number of quite radical policies on the economy. The advantage he had is he had economic credibility. And I'm afraid to say it, if we look at ourselves honestly in the mirror, for reasons which are no fault of our own, because we allow it in many ways for Tories to pin the blame for the financial crash in 2008 on us in an outrageous way, but nevertheless a successful way. And because I'm afraid of, you know, because of what's happened over the last few years, we have a real problem in terms of economic competence and economic credibility. And I think there's a number of ways through that, but a big part of it is about being pro-business. And that is really going to resonate, I'm sure, with a lot of people on this call, and exactly what SME for Labour stands for. Say, we are actually the pro-business party. Look what the candid approach to the Brexit negotiations has done to business in this country. Let's get Cllr out there with a kind of vanguard of progressive business leaders, talking about the need for a partnership, for a new kind of growth between an active state and a progressive business community that wants the best for our country. Let's have an industrial strategy that drives a modern manufacturing renaissance. Let's get the green industrial revolution at the heart of the agenda, but let's do it in cooperation with business, co-designing these policies with business, not in an ivory tower in Westminster, but actually showing that we are a bit. So just as Cllr's appeared with the Union Jack over his shoulder, I want to see him appearing with a phalanx of progressive business leaders who are actually buying into Labour's economic narrative and agenda. Overall, just to close, I think that I'm optimistic, because I think that the cosmopolitan communitarian divides that have been so difficult for Labour to navigate, I think that as we begin to see the impact of Brexit, we're going to begin to see an injection of realism into our politics. And as that realism comes to the fore, it will lead to an erosion of the very sharp polarization between Leave and Remain, and the coming to the foreground of a more what you might call normal politics, which is actually about the economy, which is actually about our place in the world, and which is not so deeply polarized around the kind of identity politics and identity tribes that have defined UK politics, I would say, at least over the last decade. And the issue of immigration, of course, has been a touchstone issue in that context. And I get the sense that the immigration issue is also beginning to fade a bit. And I think that gives us cause for optimism. And it's about demonstrating then that the COVID crisis, the realism of Brexit, combined with what the COVID crisis, I think, means in terms of creating a 1945 moment where people will realize that we actually need to invest in our public services and in our infrastructure, and that we need each other. We need that sense of community and solidarity. And that, I believe, will play into Labour's court, as long as we get this thing right about being whole nation and understanding that we're still perceived to be an overtly cities, graduates, cosmopolitan party. We need the pendulum to swing back towards the communitarians, and the way to do that is through place, patriotism, and prosperity. Thanks very much, Mabel.
Thank you both. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Stephen. Those were really great speeches, and it's really good to hear your perspective on everything that is happening in America and here, and how we can improve our chances. Thank you to everyone who has submitted a question, and we will go through all of them. I'm going to be cheeky as chair and ask my question first. So the first question, the only question I'm going to ask today, because I know we have a lot, is the primary reason, as Matt pointed out earlier, the primary reason why Trump's election defeat, in my opinion, one of the key reasons is his handling of the coronavirus. We've seen here that Boris has done a terrible job. We've had excess losses that we shouldn't have ever had. It's just been an absolute disaster. But sadly, the Conservatives seem to be polling better. What do we think that we could learn from America, or what do we think that the Labour Party can do differently to improve our poll ratings? And then I'll just take two more questions from the audience, so I can take a few at a time. We've got a question from Conrad. Could you comment on how well the Biden campaign was run, targeting voters? What techniques and strategies stood out that Labour should be using? And Dan asked the question, are we a bridge between two continents? Because he thinks that Biden doesn't seem to agree so. So I'll let you both determine which questions you would like to answer.
Do you want me to go first, Mabel? Or
yeah, please do.
Yeah. So on, you know, like, yeah, I mean, I did say, I think we should be very clear that Trump would have won had he handled COVID even slightly differently. If somebody had come to him in the early days and said, you need to make America great again masks, and we're going to make millions, and you're going to tell everyone it's patriotic duty to do that, his campaign would have raised millions, and the virus would have spread less aggressively, and I think he would have won. And while it's true that Boris Johnson is doing a terribly bad job of managing the pandemic, I think that where Labour has to be is a bit more than just being about focusing on the incompetence of this. And in some ways, the concentration on competence as a dividing line between Labour and the Tories, I think, has proved a trap, because just as it was beginning to resonate with the public, it looks like the rollout of the vaccines is going very well, and that the government will get, at least in comparison to European counterparts and even allies in the United States, we are, you know, like the UK is doing well on vaccine rollout, which means that we look competent, and they're gonna get a boost from that. I think what you do feel in this country, though, is a sense that the grievances and the upset and the hurt that has been caused by this pandemic have not really been channeled that much. So if I were advising the leadership, I'd be advising that we channel a little bit more about the frustration and the personal hurt and the anger about this incompetence, rather than just doing it forensically, because I think that somebody needs to give voice to that, and to show that they care as passionately about that as those people who suffered. On the campaign and what that means, you know, what can we learn from Biden there? I mean, I think there's a few things. First, I mentioned a project called Unions 2020, which was a project run by Steve Rosenthal, who used to be the executive director and political director of the AFL-CIO, which is the trade union movement, or the trade union confederation in the US. They ran a very sophisticated and well-targeted program in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, targeted precisely at unionized and former unionized labor that had switched and voted for Trump during the election. And that was really about socializing the idea about and it was not done by the Biden campaign, but it was done by an outside organization and the trade unions, using trade union voices and voices that resonated with the trade union movement, socializing the idea that what Trump had done for them was actually nothing, that he's exacerbated the problems, that they understood why they were frustrated with the Democrat elites in Washington who ignored their concerns for many years, and then really introducing the biography of Biden and his plan to help them. And that was a long-term project targeted very, very specifically at a cohort of voters that were angry and felt frustrated with the Democratic Party and wouldn't listen actually to party messages. So I think there's something interesting in that. The other thing that the Biden campaign did was it sort of took to the next level what they call the distributed organizing model, which was a model by which all of your volunteers focus their resources and their energy where it's most needed. So it was a model developed originally in 2016 by Bernie Sanders and then applied also by Elizabeth Warren in the primary campaign. And indeed, Warren's senior campaign advisor was brought into the Biden campaign in the early days after her name is Caitlin Mitchell, and she was brought in very early after the primary process come to an end. And this was basically a way of taking all of your online canvassing, organizing and communicating and leveraging and using volunteers to have conversations where it mattered most and to build a sense of community amongst those people during a time of pandemic when they couldn't actually meet together in person and do a lot of the campaigning that they would normally do in the normal fashion. There's a saying that Biden's actual campaign manager, Jen O'Malley Dillon, had a phrase that her view of politics and volunteers is that they come originally for the candidate and they stay for the community. And so the question was, how could you build a sense of community around a campaign when lots of people were doing it from their own offices or front rooms on phones and online. And so they use Slack, Zoom meetings, and a whole host of new innovations. And indeed, the Labour Party, I think, are already in conversations with the Biden team around how they learn those lessons. And then I think on the issue about the bridge, I said that the UK cannot be a bridge anymore. I mean, I'm not so sure that the bridge is always a good analogy. A bridge is something that is walked over. So I never thought it was a great way of describing our relationship between Europe and the US. And those who were sort of skeptical of it would always say that the Americans walked over the UK to get done what they wanted to do in Europe. I think that we need to think of ourselves as a nation that has a global history and a set of global relationships. And we can be an innovator. I think that we can be a pathfinder in new forms of collaboration and multilateralism. I think that we can be a defender of the rule of law and liberal democratic values around the world. We still have a very strong security role to play, and our voice will be respected in NATO, but also in the UN Security Council. And then I think we can be a pathfinder, finding new ways to lead on big global issues. But it is absolutely clear that the Biden administration do not see us as the place that they will call first on their way to Brussels to make sure that their politics in the EU can be addressed. They may pop by on the way back from Berlin, France, Berlin, Paris, or Brussels, but they will not stop here first. With the exception perhaps of this year because we are hosting the G7 and COP26, but that is the exception that will prove the rule otherwise.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just will touch on the question about COVID and the opinion polls, and then on the bridge question. The government is going to get a vaccine bounce. There's no doubt about that. And of course, the risk with all of this is that people only remember the end of a crisis and they don't remember what they went through, because they quite understandably would rather delete the whole horrific experience from their memories. And the vaccine is a tremendous national effort, and the government's going to get credit for it, even though it's actually about the NHS delivering and anything that the government has touched, which it's tried to do through providers such as Serco, for example, on test and trace, has been a complete disaster. So I think Matt's absolutely right that we've got to move deeper than the competence question now and get to the root of why it is that we've ended up with the highest death toll and the worst economic recession. And it's got to be about resilience. It's got to be about showing that you need a government that builds the long-term resilience of your economy and of your society from a health point of view, from an infrastructure point of view, from a skills and education point of view. And that we've got to then mercilessly repeat the mantra that the Conservatives will never be able to build that resilience because they are driven by short-termism. You know, are we really going to get a party that doesn't believe, that had to be shamed into free school meals by a professional footballer to agree to the far-reaching reforms that are required to build resilience going forward? So I think that it's got to now go deeper. I think Cllr began to set out some of those narratives in the speech that he gave on Thursday, but we're going to have to make that emotional connection as well with people to make them understand and appreciate the fact that we've got to see this as a 1945 moment, and we've got to rebuild the country. This is not a sticking plaster moment. This is fundamental. On the question of the bridge, I think that there's something here around China, which if we had a smart UK government, we would see an opportunity to actually lead on creating a transatlantic settlement and bargain around how best to address the China issue, which I think is about confront, compete, and cooperate. And it is about being very robust in terms of the way we confront on issues of human rights and the rule of law. Very clear that we need to cooperate on things like pandemics and climate change, but particularly in terms of competing, about getting that level playing field in terms of the way that trade works and intellectual property, but also looking at at technology. And okay, we've got an issue around 5G. We've got very little thinking about what artificial intelligence is going to mean for the future. Where is the technology strategy around quantum computing, and so many of these areas where China is going to continue to pull ahead of us unless we pool our resources. So what about a grand bargain of democracies to come together and create the kind of investment that's required for huge amounts of investment in R&D in those areas, which actually shapes a better future for our countries and actually is a good way for democracies to work together in order to be able to compete on a level playing field with China in these vitally important areas. The route to power in the 21st century is through technology. And if the West doesn't wake up to that soon, we're going to be in an even more exposed position than we are already.
Thank you so much. We've had a number of questions submitted about unity. So could you just tell us how do you think that Cllr could better to unite the Labour Party, and how that will help us in terms of winning an election? And also in terms of working with the opposition, there's a question here where it says, Joe Biden said we need to stop treating our opponents as enemies. Do you think a more considerate approach benefits the Labour Party and its ambitions? That's an interesting question. And then there's some questions about voter motivation. So what can we do to win back certain votes, such as our Black community, as we move towards more nationalism, like a nationalist approach? And if possible, could I also allow Tracy Bramburn to come in and ask her question? Tracy, are you here? You're still on mute. I don't.
I'm now unmuted. It's you were in charge. Thank you. Mabel, I don't know if you want to take those questions first, or shall I just dive in very quickly?
Oh, if you dive in, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me this evening, and certainly great to see so many friends here from the SME community. And honestly, you have had an awful year and been a campaigner for the excluded and limited company directors, I know how hard it has been for you. So just a couple of things for those that don't know. I'm the Labour candidate for the Mayor of West Yorkshire, and a proud Yorkshire woman, and will be the first ever woman Metro Mayor in the country. So I'm very excited about what Matt was saying about the agenda to get women back into work was something that appealed to voters. But I do think that the COVID pandemic has proved that it is a tale of two countries, that those people like myself who can work from home and is safe and it hasn't really impacted on my life, and those people for whom it has been a torrid year and have lost loved ones and jobs, and also really exposed to COVID themselves. One thing I wanted to ask Matt is, in the campaigning, and we're doing it all online on Zooms, and in fact I've just left a round table where we are developing our manifesto with the community. So we did one on policing last week. This week was business, and we wanted to hear from businesses what you wanted in the manifesto and how you felt we could have a safe and just and fair recovery from COVID, whilst also being ambitious for our region. But one thing that has really struck me, whilst we've got a very young campaign, it's very exciting with lots of engaged young people, but we are still struggling with diversity, because the Black, Asian and minority ethnic community aren't necessarily on social media, on Zooms, coming to Zoom phone banks. So it was just a quick question to Matt. How can we extend our reach and engage people to get involved? Because I can't tell you how important it is for our region that we have a Labour mayor. The strength and the authority, together with Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham, Dan Jarvis in Sheffield, hopefully Liam Byrne in the Midlands, and also we've got Jamie Driscoll in further north. You know, the power of that to say this is what the Labour country could look like under Cllr. As the Labour in the north, you know, we have an authority working together that can actually turn the tide and get Cllr into number 10. But in order for that to happen, I need to be elected. So Matt, if you have any suggestions, I'd be very happy to hear them. And just finally, anyone on this Zoom who wants to get involved in the campaign, you are so very welcome. And I know Ibrahim has been a champion right from the beginning when I became a member of Parliament 5 years ago. So thank you, Ibrahim, for your support. But over to you, Matt.
Great, thanks. So Tracy, I'll try and start with your question first, and then deal with the others in a more broadly and sort of like overall response. One of the things that the Biden campaign did was to identify influencers in communities that were hard to reach. So, you know, there was a clear understanding that those people who volunteer, not just those people who support you and vote for you, but those people who are going to volunteer for you, are likely to come from a particular cohort of voters who both have the time and the inclination to do this. So what the Biden campaign did was identify communities that it needed to win, that it felt should understand what his message were. And then they went out and recruited influencers and what they called fellows. Now, the fellowship program was for non-celebrity people, because this was an American campaign and billions of dollars were being spent. They paid these fellows with targets to have certain conversations within their community and to report back on the nature of that conversation and to hopefully encourage people to engage in the more standard forms of outreach that they were doing. And then with the influencers, they would go to, you know, more higher profile individuals, again, who appeal to those communities and found different ways of connecting. And beyond that, they would also very clearly go to particular media. So, you know, I think this has been an age-old problem of many politicians, that they think that if it's not in the Times, the New York Times or the LA Times or the Washington Post or something like that, then it's not really in the media. But the Biden campaign was much more sophisticated about using its surrogates, influencers, and indeed the candidate itself to talk to much more localized and particular community or media that was focused around groups they couldn't reach. So I think, you know, like to sort of shorten that down into a couple of lessons. One is find the people who have relationships with the people you want to talk to and get them to do the talking for you. And failing that, find the places, the media, social or traditional or otherwise, that these communities read and talk to the people who run that media. Because that's a much more effective way than having a standard generalized message. Just quickly on Biden and not treating opponents as enemies, I think that's right. I think that's really his view on that, though, is much more about the tone and tenor of politics rather than what he wants to do, right? So if you listen to Joe Psaki, who's the White House spokesperson, she's been criticized by some members of the right-wing press, or the Biden administration has been criticized by and questioned by some members of the right-wing press in her press conferences about why they failed to get a single Republican, either in the House or the Senate, it looks like, to vote for the recovery bill. And her argument is like, look, we want to be the administration for everyone, but we still have disagreements with our opponents. So when 70% of the American public want this bill to go through, we'll push it through as a Democrat bill. So they are still very aggressive in terms of pushing forward their values. They just feel that you should be respectful in the tone and tenor of the debate. And in that regard, I think what they're trying to do is to create a framework in which you play the issues and the substance of the matter rather than the people. There's a feeling that, this is the case in the UK too, that politics has become very personalized and poisonous. And if you can suck some of that poison out of the politics and play the issues and the substance rather than the people involved, then we'll all be better off for it. But that doesn't mean that we all have to sit around the campfire singing Kumbaya with people we disagree with, who are our opponents. We can have profound disagreements and we can push through agendas without their support, but we just have to be respectful about the way we do it. And my view on that would be that might be the same, an advisable strategy too for unifying the Labour Party. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Look, in December, we got the worst election results since 1935. Our vote collapsed in areas of the country where, those are the people that the Labour Party was founded to represent. And it was absolutely brilliant to hear from Tracy there, and I wish her all the very best with her campaign. She's doing an absolutely fantastic job, and really fingers crossed for that. And I think that that's just a great example of what we need to do to rebuild in our heartlands and to regain the trust of the electorate. And I think that's what Cllr's been focusing on really since April, is to rebuild trust. There's been a lot of work done, I think, in terms of just demonstrating that we are a party that is really serious about getting into government, and that we know we've got a lot of people to persuade in order to get us there. And just, we're not a party of just protesting. Protest has its place, and it's very important that we speak out robustly when we need to, and we campaign robustly at all times. But we also have to persuade, and we've got to show people that we are serious about winning. And then so I think the next phase in Project Cllr, if you like, is around having rebuilt trust and credibility. And let's not forget, we were 25 points behind the Tories in the opinion polls in April, and we are now neck and neck. But I think what that demonstrates is we've done what we need to do to get a hearing, but in order to kick on, we've got to start really focusing in on what the issues are that matter, the bread and butter issues: work, family, community, and security. That sort of patriotic internationalism that we talked about, recognizing that Brexit is going to be doing damage, being prepared to talk about that, because that's a really important way of demonstrating that the Tories are not actually acting in the national interest, hammering them on the cronyism side. Rachel Reeves has been doing a great job on that, and just demonstrating that we are actually the party that acts in the national interest and that we're ready for government. And I think that colleagues across all of our traditions within the party need to recognise that. And unity is not actually the same as unanimity. You're never going to get unanimity in any Labour Party meeting of more than one person. So it's got to be about unity, which is around focusing relentlessly on being ready to win the next general election, because we can have all the principles and dreams for our country and the world, but if we don't win in 2024, we're not going to be able to put any of those into practice.
Brilliant, thank you both. Unfortunately, we don't seem to have a lot of time left. There's only 4 minutes. So I'm gonna end on a fairly fun question. The question is, can Biden win in 2024? And if so, if not, what will he have to do differently? Stephen, do you want to go first?
Yes, absolutely, he can. I'm a socialist, so I'm therefore an optimist. The two things definitely go together. And I think Joe has waited a long time for this moment, and you can really see that he's a guy who has a plan. I've been so impressed by the transition, so impressed by the way he's set the team up. He hasn't put a foot wrong, and that bodes well for the future. And it's also that it's not kind of happening as a big flashbang supernova. It's much more incremental, step by step, and that works. So I think there's no reason, as long as Joe himself is fit and healthy for the next round, to go for it. But he's also got some very, very good people around him. And I think that I'm pretty optimistic that for the future of progressive politics in the United States.
And Matt, just wanted to ask, there is a question here. Where is your lamp from?
Yes, so I actually answered the question about the lamp privately, which is I don't know, I'll have to get back because it wasn't my purchase. I don't do the designing in my flat, I'm afraid. So I'll get back to you on that. But look, on Biden, the key to whether Biden can win re-election is what happens over the next 18 months. He basically has to put through some bills that find their way into changing people's lives in the United States. He has to show that voting for him and the promises he made actually delivers some form of tangible change in people's lives. And if he's not able to do that, then I think the climate for himself or for any other candidate who may want to seek the presidency on behalf of the Democratic Party is very, very difficult. I think that's why you see him being, this is why the Democratic Party is sort of almost united as one around his entire agenda, because they know that for all of them, including those that are up at the midterms in 2022, that next year, in November next year, that what needs to happen is the Democrats need to make some changes in American life. Personally, myself, I think that even if he does that, I am skeptical that he'll be the candidate. I suspect that we'll be looking at a transition in 2024 to a new generation. But that, whether if or when we find that out, I think will be quite some time, because no president is going to announce that they only intend to run and exercise the office for one term. But the key is delivery, is the short answer.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you to everyone who's attended. I felt like this was a really good session and we had some great answers. As I mentioned at the start, we are going to take a picture to remind us all of how great this event was. It's not compulsory. If you don't want to be in the picture, do keep your camera off. But if you're happy to be in the photo, want to see your best Zoom smiles if possible.
Make sure you get Matt's lamp in.
Yeah, the lamp is clearly more, gets more importance than the rest of us. Okay, brilliant. So if we all smile.
I know that you like it, Steve.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I can tell you didn't pick it.
Definitely not me. No.
Brilliant. Awesome. And I believe that picture has been taken. Thank you so much. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and hope to see you at the next event that SME for Labour hold. Take care.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.